This is class number 16 of 20. So we're closing in on getting to discuss the actual import of all of this. But before we got to that, I wanted to be addressing this one other major case that we did. For the last 7 weeks, we have been basically setting the stage for this particular case. This is the case that the Christic Institute became best known for. This is the one that generated a huge national scandal that threatened to topple the entire Reagan-Bush administration. And we'll talk more about that in the next couple classes that talk about the congressional investigations and the special prosecutor investigations and the major news media investigations of this. But while the other cases that we dealt with at the Christic Institute were very important, the Karen Silkwood case, for example, for stopping the construction of all private nuclear power plants in the United States from 1979 to 2012 is very important. The Pentagon Papers case was very important. It contributed to bringing the Vietnam War to an earlier end, and the establishment of the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources in re Pappas and the other companion cases was very important because it established an ability on the part of news journalists to get inside organizations, both governmental and corporate, to get access to information for people, which played a large role in the 60s. But the Iran-Contra case is the case that attracted probably the most prolonged attention on the part of the Christic Institute, and established the Christic Institute as what many perceive to be as one of the major players in the 60s. In using that period of the 60s as an expansive period between 1965 and 1980, that whole period of confrontation that went on, and it actually played a major role in keeping George Bush Sr. from winning a second term in office, and thereby stopped him from implementing what was his plan for this new world order that he had designed at the end of the Cold War. And so for that reason, we're going to be devoting 3 of our classes to this, the discussion of this particular matter. Today, we'll talk about the investigation, the whole process by means of which we came to discover what we came to discover from the time at the end of March of 1984 when we were told by this commander of the Louisiana State National Guard about this plot that was going on to smuggle weapons from the United States Pentagon to the Contras in direct defiance of the congressional resolution passed by the Congress, the Boland Amendment, prohibiting such aid, all the way up to and including the day of the filing, from the end of March of 1984, therefore, to the end of May of 1986. There will be this 2-year period during which we conducted the investigation in this case. Part 2 on next Tuesday, on the 29th of May, the actual anniversary of the filing of the Iran-Contra case, we'll go through the entire trial preparation, the entire period of discovery, depositions, document demands, the major fight that we went through in the federal court in Miami to try to get this case to trial. And then on Thursday, the 30th of next week, we'll deal with the appellate process and the congressional hearings, the special prosecutor, and the eventual pardons that were issued by George Bush Sr. For all of the people that were indicted as a result of the charges that we made against them. Now, this investigation basically developed the information that you have read. This is the kind of the public document that you've been reading, a little light bedtime reading. several footnotes for you to, so that you'll have it, so that you can keep it and refer to it again and again and again when you want to really understand the depth of detail that we had when we filed this case. This is the actual official form in which that affidavit was filed. This is an exact copy of the actual filing that was made with the federal district court, setting forth all of that information. But that is not what is known as the sort of famous affidavit that is talked about so much with regard to the Iran-Contra case. That particular affidavit is this one. This is the affidavit that was filed in April, or excuse me, December of 1986. We filed the actual complaint in May of 1986, and this is the affidavit that we filed later in December. And I'll explain all of that next week during the process of discussing the court filing. But what this does is it sets forth the investigative steps that we took prior to the filing of the complaint. Because the defendants in the case, the 26 defendants, filed a motion demanding that the federal court summarily dismiss the case. They felt that every minute that this complaint remained active in the federal court, they were in extreme danger, which is true. And so they wanted to get the federal judge in Miami to dismiss the case as soon as they possibly could. And so we filed this particular affidavit so as to put into the record at the trial court level what the information was that we had on the basis of which we were demanding the right to go to trial. And what this did is this affidavit basically paralyzed the judge, who very much wanted to summarily dismiss the complaint. And I'll go through the details of that next week. But what this sets forth is it tells about the investigation. As I told you at the end of March of 1984, we came across this information from the commander of the Louisiana State National Guard, that Bill Taylor interviewed him and found out about this whole plot that was going on to attempt to transfer weapons from the American Pentagon to the state defense forces and then to the Contras. And so that when we finally won the appeal down in Texas on the American Sanctuary Movement case, we came back to Washington, D.C., and we closeted with our investigators, and we said, look, if this is true, what has been reported to us by the commander of the National Guard down in Louisiana, then we have stumbled onto clearly impeachable offenses, open defiance on the part of the executive branch of an express order given to them by the Congress not to be providing any military aid, direct or indirect, to the Contras that had been internationally disgraced by a ruling against them by the International Court of Justice in The Hague, finding them to be international war criminals for having publicly mined the harbors, or mining the public harbors in Nicaragua. So we gathered our investigators together, and as I said, we had Bill Taylor, who was the president of the Florida Association of Professional Private Investigators, and was the head of the security force for the governor of Florida, was one of our investigators. He was my former investigator at F. Lee Bailey's office, and had been our chief investigator in the Karen Silkwood case and in the Greensboro case. We also had Howard Cohen, who was the Washington bureau chief for Rolling Stone magazine. We had Howard Rosenberg, who was the chief researcher for Dan Rather at CBS Evening News. And we had Bob Fink, who was the staff investigator for Bella Abzug, whom I've mentioned a number of times before. What we were initially faced with the challenge of having to find someone who would have standing. Now this is I don't want to get over technical about this. You won't have to deal with this stuff until you get to law school. But one of the key features of a major lawsuit is that you have to have as your plaintiff a person who has been uniquely injured in some specific way that has transgressed some type of a common law right that this person has, or a statutory right that's been granted by a state or federal legislature. And you have to be litigating on behalf of them. So there has to be a real case or controversy in order to invoke the jurisdiction of the courts. Now, this turns out to be a major tactic that was used by the Rehnquist court when William Rehnquist ascended to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court under Ronald Reagan, that they clamped down on this issue of standing. They started taking a more and more narrow view of who had standing. But at this point, back in 1984, when Rehnquist was on the Supreme Court and starting to attack along that line, we realized that we were going to have to go to some lengths to find someone that was uniquely injured in some specific way. So we began to have these discussions among ourselves at the Christic Institute about how we could find someone who had standing, who had been directly injured as a result of this conspiracy that was going on. Because the conspiracy, from one point of view, was just a conspiracy to violate a law that had been passed by Congress. So that unless you could talk somebody from Congress into filing the lawsuit and saying that, look, I'm representing Congress and we're offended at the fact that this is being violated, it'd be hard to figure out how to get someone to have standing. So we were exploring a number of different issues. Since I had been at Jesuit headquarters. Yes, Toby?
Sorry, I just had a quick question. Why would the refugees know it being good enough plaintiffs?
Well, refugees, for example, in the case that we had with Brenda and Mauricio, they were being threatened by these death squads, but that was not the Contras. You see, the Contras are what Congress had prohibited from getting the weaponry. They'd been overthrown in Nicaragua, and they were now thrown out of government. So this crowd was actually a non-national player. And so the military death squads and stuff that were functioning in El Salvador and in Guatemala, for example, were operative agents of those governments. And the Congress of the United States had not passed any resolution prohibiting the administration from giving any aid to them. It was just these Contras who had been expressly declared to be international criminals by the International Court of Justice. So we were trying to figure out how to find someone who, we began to explore the possibilities of the fact that the Contras were launching military attacks, paramilitary attacks into Nicaragua, attacking civilian villages and assassinating and murdering people. So we were exploring that possibility of getting them to be plaintiffs. But during that period of time while we were attempting to ascertain what the ideal plaintiff would be, again noting that as cause lawyers, as a 501c3 public interest law firm, we have the right to identify an issue that needs to get resolved judicially and go find a plaintiff to actually bring the action before a court. And so while we were doing this, it turns out that we were trying to figure out the contours of this conspiracy. We had discovered in Louisiana that the Louisiana State National Guard had received weapons from the United States Pentagon and had received orders to transfer those weapons to these state defense forces in the state of Louisiana. And that the state of Louisiana, the state legislature, had passed a statute creating this state defense force. So we began to look to see what other states had passed one of those types of statutes. Virtually nobody knew anything about these statutes, but there were two other states, both Texas and Alabama, had passed statutes similar to that. So we turned our attention toward Alabama and Texas, trying to figure out what was going on there. And it turns out that while we were engaged in attempting to discover this thing, I was sitting out at a Rupe house on Sunday morning, and I opened up after getting back from Mass over at the National Cathedral, sat down and was opening up the Washington Post, and here is an article written by Brian Barger. Brian Barger was the fellow that one of the defendants that I represented in the big demonstrations at the White House when we went in and staged the sit-in at the White House against Ford and his amnesty program. I told you, remember, with the Berrigans and Dr. Spock and everybody else, when we had this big melee there at the White House. Brian Barger, who was the president of the student body at the University of Maryland, is the fellow one of the defendants we had represented, who wrote the letter to the White House to set up the appointments for us to have. Well, Brian, all of a sudden, here I am, 1984, this is like April, early May of 1984. Hi, Ron. And I look at this newspaper article, and Brian Barger has written this article. And it turns out that this is what had happened. Brian Barger, after graduating from the University of Maryland, had gone on to become a reporter for the Associated Press. And he had been contacted by a friend of his, who was another reporter, who told him around Christmas of 1983 that she had been down in Miami, and she had heard the rumor that there was a training camp, a paramilitary training camp out in the Everglades somewhere, and that there were people allegedly training people to help fight for the Contras down in Nicaragua, and actually in Honduras, where they were based. And so she told Brian about this, and so Brian Barger is one of the major heroes of this whole story, of which there are a number. But Brian went to his editors at the Associated Press and asked for permission to go down to try to find this paramilitary training base down in the Everglades and interview the people that were there training to fight for the Contras, and to find out who was training them. Very pointedly, to try to figure out who was supplying them with military equipment, since the Congress had prohibited the supply of any weapons and supplies to them. So Brian was refused permission by the Associated Press. Now this becomes very important, because the Associated Press turns out to be infiltrated by agents of Project Mockingbird from the Central Intelligence Agency, and that they were in fact trying to shut down any bona fide effort to investigate this violation of the Boland Amendment. And so they refused to finance Brian's trip. So Brian took a leave of absence from the Associated Press, and on his own nickel goes down to Florida. And he goes out into the Everglades looking for this base. And he hangs around, you know, the haunts around Miami and in South Beach and other places, starts talking to people, because he speaks fluent Spanish, right? And so he's trying to find out where this base is. And so he finds out where the base is. He goes out to the base and he starts interviewing all the guys out in the jungle, right? And, you know, they're jumping out of trees and running around in the woods and learning how to march. And the bottom line is he discovers that they're being trained by former U.S. military guys, some Green Berets and other military guys. And when he's there, he finds out that they're planning to have a major meeting in Honduras, in Tegucigalpa. They're going to be having a meeting the following month, and Brian wants to go there. There's going to be lots of American former military people coming together to figure out how to put together a funding program for these Contras, in light of the fact that Congress has prohibited the CIA and any other agency of the executive branch from giving any assistance to the Contras. So Brian ends up going down to Tegucigalpa, and it's kind of cool, sitting in the lobby at the hotel with a newspaper. Didn't exactly have the two holes in it, you know, looking through, but he's sitting in the lobby watching all of these kind of these American guys in camouflage, you know, government surplus military outfits walking up and around everywhere, and finally some guy comes over and sits down next to him and starts talking to him about. And Brian starts asking him what they're doing there, and the guy asks Brian what he's doing there, and Brian tells him that he's a reporter. You know, and that he's very interested in this, and he wants to have their side of the story, you know, because the Congress has cut off all these supplies, and he's concerned about this, Brian, and he wants to get them to tell their story. And so the guy starts, you know, proselytizing on behalf of the Contras, and actually invites Brian Barger into a meeting of the executive committee of the people that are there at the hotel. So for those of you who aren't going to go to law school and are going to be journalists, you have to pay attention to how this stuff gets done. Right? And so Brian is sitting there, in the meeting of the executive committee with all of these guys, right? And one of the guys, the guy who would come and sat down next to him, his name is Tom Posey. And Tom Posey starts telling Brian Barger about how they've set this thing up, a group called the Civilian Military Assistance Group in Alabama. And they are the state defense forces. And they have been getting military equipment from the 20th Special Forces, who are declaring it to be war surplus. They're not putting it on the market to anybody else. They're just making it available to the people who are in the Civilian Military Assistance Group. And so he's got this great big garage filled with M16s and a million rounds of ammunition for M16s and shoulder-fired stuff, bazookas and grenades and everything that he's got. And he's telling Brian all about this. So Brian comes back from these meetings and he writes up this article and he gets it published in the Washington Post. So here I am, the month after we found out about this thing going on down in Louisiana, trying to figure out how we can find out more about this. And here's an article about these guys in the Washington Post. So I pick up the telephone and call Brian. I still got his phone number from when I represented him. So I call him and I say, Brian, this is Danny. Come on over to Rupe House and let's talk about this. So he comes over and we sit down and start talking about this, right? So he gives me all this information about what this outfit is doing. So now we know what's going on in Louisiana. So we then call back the commander of the National Guard in Louisiana. He checks into it and finds out the civilian military group in that state defense forces in Louisiana, they have brought all of that extra equipment that they got to keep when they revalued the equipment and left half of it in their hands. They have brought it down to New Orleans and they have shipped it out, mixed in with humanitarian aid that's being run by a group called Friends of America. And one of the state legislators in the Louisiana State Legislature, Woody Jenkins, was the head of this thing, and they were smuggling the weapons through the Friends of America, this 501c3 organization, allegedly engaged in humanitarian relief. They were smuggling weapons to the Contras. So we found out about that, and we filed a complaint against them with the Internal Revenue Service, got their 501c3 revoked, and shut that operation down. And then we began investigating the operation in Alabama, and Tom Posey ended up introducing Brian Barger to a guy by the name of Jack Terrell. And we go meet Jack Terrell. I go meet Jack Terrell with Brian Barger. And Jack Terrell starts telling us how he was really the guy, along with Posey, that was running the Civilian Military Assistance Group down in Alabama. He starts telling about all of their exploits. He starts giving us names of all the different guys. These guys were proud of what they were doing, right? And so they're saying, hey, we're civilians. We're civilians. We're not the CIA. We're not the Pentagon. Okay, we're getting our weapons from the Pentagon, but we're civilians. They didn't seem to dawn on them that there was such a thing as the Federal Neutrality Act that made it a federal crime for civilians to mount a military operation against any government with whom the United States has diplomatic relations. So they were just kind of flagrantly going along bragging about this. And so Jack Terrell actually shows me a copy of his diary, where he's been keeping daily diary entries of all the guys he's meeting with and how much weapons they're shipping around and all this kind of stuff. And I said, hey, can I get a Xerox copy of that? And he says, sure, I'll give you a Xerox copy. I'll give you a Xerox copy. And so we started getting all this information. We're putting all this stuff together. And then Brian comes to me and he says, look, Posey has just flown into Washington and wanted me to come to meet with him. And we went over into the park in Washington, over in Lafayette Park, and we sat down with a guy by the name of Rob Owen. And Rob Owen is telling me, he says Brian, that he is the personal representative to the Contras in the go-between between him and Colonel Oliver North, who is the deputy director of the National Security Council for political military liaison. And that Rob Owen is the guy going back and forth taking orders from the Contras as to what kind of weaponry and explosives they want. And then he brings them back and gives them to Oliver North. And then Oliver North is going around to rich right-wing Republicans and asking them for private donations, to give private donations to finance the Civilian Military Assistance Group and the other groups so they can turn around and purchase weapons. So the question arises is, where are these weapons coming from? There were the weapons coming from the Pentagon during the readiness exercise, but that was a temporary thing. So the question is, where were the rest of these weapons coming from? And so we began to try to explore to figure out where they were coming from. And it turns out that when we discovered that the Alabama group, the Civilian Military Assistance Group, were taking the weapons that they got from the 20th Special Forces and they were transporting them in trucks over to Florida, and they were working with members of the 2506 Brigade. You remember these guys. These are the right-wing anti-Castro Cubans in Miami, the 2506 Brigade, and Alpha 66. They were working with them to fly them out of the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport. So that they, and remember the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport? That's the place that had this little mysterious building that Billy Taylor, ended up finding all about, which was the National Intelligence Academy, where they were doing the surveillance training against Silkwood. So there he is at the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport, and here they are flying flights out. So Billy Taylor sits down and starts copying down their tail numbers, copying down the tail numbers of the flights that were going in and out. And then he goes and talks with Jack Terrell and says, what kind of stuff is on these planes anyhow? And he says, oh, well, let me see. I've got a copy of the flight manifest here. And he gives him a copy of the flight manifest. So we've got the flight manifest. We got the serial numbers of the weapons. We got the serial numbers on the airplanes. And so we say to them, Billy says, where are they flying these things to? The guy says, oh, we're flying them down to John Hull's ranch down in Costa Rica. So we go and find John Hull's ranch down in Costa Rica, and we got the names of about 8 or 10 of these guys that are flying these flights around. And then Jack Terrell starts to complain to us about the fact that he's upset about the fact that when they fly this military equipment down to John Hull's ranch, they unload all the military equipment, that they've been flying cocaine back into the United States, out of John Hull's ranch. And they fly it back into the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport because they've gotten clearance. The CIA has contacted the FAA and has gotten clearance on those flights. Every flight has this little machine in the airplane that sends out these radio signals, that sends out their tail numbers and stuff so that the radar people can follow them, etc. And so that the CIA had put in special provisions not to stop these airplanes and not to search them, not to put them through customs, etc. So they had gotten a free pass, basically, to fly this military equipment out down to John Hull's ranch. And so they said, hey, look, we've got a free pass flying back. Why deadhead, as they said to us? Why not bring something back? And so they start flying back cocaine, which is coming from Jorge Ochoa and Pablo Escobar out of the Colombian cocaine cartel out of Colombia. And so they're flying the cocaine back, and they're flying the weapons back and forth. And here we are getting the details of all of this. And then at that time, it turns out we find out about the fact that there has been a bombing. A bomb explosion has taken place down in Costa Rica. The famous Comandante Zero, Eden Pastora, who was one of the major comandantes in the Sandinista revolutionary movement against Anastasio Somoza, had become disenchanted with the leadership of the Sandinista revolutionary government after they'd thrown out Somoza. And Danny Ortega and Thomas Borge were becoming kind of exclusive about their power and control. So Eden Pastora felt slighted, so he withdrew from the Sandinista government and was being courted by the Contras that were the National Guard people from Somoza. And so they were trying to get him to join forces with them, but Eden Pastora had gotten really offended by these guys because they were drug smuggling, and they were ripping off money, getting extra money for the weapons and getting funding through Oliver North, covert funding from all of these secret right-wing Republicans that were contributing private donations to them, and they were keeping the money. And they were feeding the guys rice and beans out in the field, but they were getting extra money, and they were taking daily stipends, and they were staying in big hotel rooms and having me. And so Eden Pastora got really PO'd at these guys, and he was getting ready to hold a press conference announcing that he was denouncing the FDN Contras that were headed by Adolfo Calero and the others. So he schedules a press conference at this place called La Panka, which is this little mud hut village down on the Rio San Juan River, which is the border between Costa Rica and Nicaragua. And so he schedules this meeting, and he gathers all the press people together, and they come in boats and everything. They all come in, and there are about probably 50 people there in this big old hut. And Eden Pastora comes out at a little podium just like this, and he begins to give an interview to the press people and make his statement denouncing the Contras. And there's this horrendous explosion that blows up the place. And you can see the footage of it on the internet. If you look up the La Panka bombing, you'll actually see video footage because there were reporters there with the cameras going, including Tony Avergan, who was the reporter. He was the television cameraman for ABC Evening News that was there. He's an independent cameraman and reporter, but he'd been retained by ABC because they don't have a lot of guys that'll ride in canoes and go down the river into the jungles to do this kind of video footage. But Tony did. And so he was there at the place, and he gets blown up with everybody else. Well, they end up killing 5 of the journalists, and they end up seriously injuring like about 25 others. They lost eyes and arms and hands and everything in this explosion. Tony Avergan had all of his television equipment blown up, and he was injured with shrapnel and stuff. And so that we heard about this bombing taking place, and it turns out that Tony Avergan and his wife, Martha Honey. Now, Tony Avergan and Martha Honey are other heroes in this story, because when they experienced this bombing that took place, they in fact began their own independent investigation to find out what the heck had happened here, who had done this thing. They obviously suspected that it was the Contras who were trying to stop him from having this public press conference denouncing them and telling the world that they were criminals and they were ripping off all the money and stuff, and telling that they were getting it from Oliver North. So there were a lot of people that would have been the suspects normally. And so Martha Honey and Tony Avergan began this big investigation, and a peculiar thing happened. There was this fellow by the name of Carlos Chinchilla, who just happened to be down in San Juan, Costa Rica, and he was at this little bar restaurant thing, and a guy comes into the restaurant. These 3 guys come in, and they're standing at the door looking kind of around like this, and then 2 of them leave and go down the road, and one of them remains, and he's looking around at everybody in the restaurant, and then he comes all the way over to Carlos, and he sits down, and he says, "Look, I need you to help me. I've gotten myself in with a group of really bad guys. You know, they're part of this Contra force, and they all are gathered out at this ranch owned by John Hull outside of town here. And I don't want to be there anymore. My brother and I were both working with the Contras, but these people are all smuggling cocaine. And besides, they're getting set to plan, they're in the process of planning to assassinate the United States ambassador to Costa Rica. They're going to assassinate him and try to blame it on the Sandinista government. And you got to help me. Can you help me get out of here?" And so this guy, Carlos, says to this guy, David, his name is, he says, "Look, I don't want to get involved in this. You know, I've got a wife and a new baby. I don't want to do any of this, you know." And so finally the 2 guys come back, and this guy, David, had told him that they were going down casing out the American embassy to figure out where to put the bomb and explosives to kill Louis Tams, the U.S. ambassador. And so finally they come back, and David writes a phone number and gives it to Carlos and says, "Please, you know, call me and give me your phone number." And Carlos gives him his phone number. And so they take off and they leave. And what happens is that a short while later, the Attorney General of Costa Rica and the president of Costa Rica is running for re-election. And Oscar Arias is running against him. And Oscar Arias starts accusing the president of Costa Rica of coddling the Contras, of allowing them to be going in and out of the country, and they've got military bases in there. And he starts talking about this John Hull's ranch in his campaign against the president. And so the president sends a military group, the local rural guard, out to John Hull's ranch, and they confiscate a couple tons of weapons out there and explosives. So they find all of these weapons and they take them away. And there's an article in the newspaper. And Carlos sees this article in the newspaper and he says, oh, wow. He says, this is that place. This is that place that guy David was telling me about. So I guess this is really true. And so what he does is he goes to see his mother and father and says, look, there's this guy who's out there saying that they've got him basically being held hostage out there, and he doesn't want to be there anymore. What should I do about this? And her mother and father said, look, we know some North Americans who live here. We'll go talk to them. So they went and talked to them, and this North American couple said, oh, wow, we ought to hook you up with Tony Avergon and Martha Honey because they're investigating this thing. And so they bring this guy David over to Martha and Tony's house, and he tells them the whole story. And so what they do is they check it all out and start checking other sources, and they verify that these are the guys that tried to kill Eden Pastora. Because they're talking with David through this guy, Carlos, goes and talks to him, and he lays out the whole details about how they all went in and tried to blow up the press conference to kill Eden Pastora. And he names all the guys that are part of it with John Hull, and there's about 6 other guys. He gives them all their names. And so Martha and Tony published this little pamphlet in which they named John Hull and these 6 other guys as being the people that blew up the Panka press conference. And John Hull, being the big blowhard that he is, says, well, you can't get away with this. I'm going to sue you and charge you with criminal libel. Now, down in Costa Rica and a number of the other Latin American countries, there's a whole kind of special attitude about family. And that if you insult somebody by name, the theory is that you're naming them, and if you give their family name, you're insulting the whole family. And so there's a criminal statute for libel down there, and that if you libel somebody, they can get the federal prosecutor to prosecute you. And so John Hull, exercising his muscle and power down there, he owned or supervised, thousands of acres of ranch where they were flying these weapons in and flying the cocaine out. And he thought he had pretty good clout with the existent president who was coddling them all. And so he got the president to get the attorney general to file criminal charges against Martha and Tony. And so we get a call from Tony Avergon, because Brian Barger told them about us, and they call us and ask us to come down and help them on their defense. They're terrified now. They're in federal criminal court being charged with a crime. They could be put in jail for 5 years for this whole thing. And they were freaked out, saying, look, we're just American journalists. What we're saying is true, but they had gotten a lawyer, and the lawyer kept saying, oh, let's do little technical things like say, they can't prove which one of you wrote which paragraph. So let's make a technical argument that, if they can't prove who wrote which paragraph, that we can get them to dismiss the charges. I mean, it was totally ludicrous. And so we came down and said, no, that's not how you do this thing. How you do this thing in a libel case is you go in and you defend yourself on the grounds that it's true. And what you do is you say, thank you very much for giving us an opportunity here now to kick your ass in court. And they were going, oh, I don't know about that. And their lawyer was going, absolutely not. That's not how it's done here. That would be even libeling them more. They were saying, it's not libeling them more. It's true. This guy, it didn't dawn on him that libel had to be untrue. That just the mere accusing people of bad stuff was like an offense down there. You don't publicly accuse people of bad things. And so we said, no, that there's a defense of truth. And so we put together a whole kind of counter-offensive for them. And we name about 25 people who we all know are involved in this and show that they did the Panka bombing. And so what we do is we go in and we file a list for the witnesses to be subpoenaed, figuring that was going to freak them out and maybe they dropped the case, but they didn't. So we go in and we start subpoenaing all these people, putting on all of this evidence, and basically the judge ends up concluding that it was true, what they said about him, and he dismisses all the charges against them. And so then they said, oh, that was really great, and we understand that you're looking for plaintiffs in your big case about what's going on here with all the weapons smuggling and all that. And we said, yes. And they said, well, how about us? Here I am. I've gotten all of my equipment blown up. I've got scars and burns and all this kind of stuff. And so we end up saying, okay, you sound like some good plaintiffs. So we start figuring out how to draft a complaint that would have them as their plaintiffs withstanding. And so we go back to Washington, D.C., and one of the things that I was doing at the time is I was chairing a thing called the Fund for Constitutional Government. Stuart Mott of the Mott Applesauce people funded this big public interest group there on 122 Maryland Avenue, right by next door to the Supreme Court, a big old swanky mansion right there. And so that they used to have these meetings in their big conference room, and we would have journalists. We had Jim Aberest, the senator from South Dakota, was on it. We had Jack Anderson's people that were on the committee. We organized subcommittees. We had a thing called the Fund for Investigative Journalism. We actually would fund investigative journalists to go look into cases that involve civil rights. We established the first project to protect whistleblowers. That was the very first place in the country that actually protected whistleblowers when I was the chairman of that particular group. And we also established a group called the Project on Military Spending that was basically blowing the whistle on these $500 hammers and $10,000 toilet seats and stuff that the military had. And so we had a bunch of these groups. One of them, this Project for Military Spending, one of the guys that was an advisor to them was a guy named Paul Hoven. Paul Hoven was this great big 6'2", 260-pound guy, with arms like legs, and used to strut around like this all the time. He was a helicopter jock in Vietnam, right? But he had become quite expert at a lot of military equipment and stuff. So he was one of the advisors to the Project on Military Procurement, and he ended up coming to one of our meetings, a number of our meetings, and nobody could quite figure me out, as it turns out there. That people kept saying, he doesn't seem like a normal liberal. There's something kind of fanatical about him, that he doesn't just take liberal positions. He's kind of more radical than that. And so there were right-wing people on the thing. We had kind of a balance of people in there. And so this guy, Paul Hoven, kind of took a liking to me. And so he comes over to me and he said to me, look, I've got to talk to you about something. He said, I met a guy over at the opening of a subdivision of the Heritage Foundation. I wouldn't be caught dead at the Heritage Foundation, but he goes to the Heritage Foundation, or other people are swaggering around. And so he said, I met this guy who started telling me about that he knew some stuff about what was going on down in Latin America in weapons smuggling and stuff like this, and he was unhappy about it because he'd leased a plane to them down there to fly military equipment down to the Contras, but it had gone down on the way back, and they told him not to go looking for it. And he wanted to mount a group up to try to find out where it was, and it turns out that it was filled with cocaine. And so he was upset about this. And so Paul Hoven said, do you know anything about that stuff? And I said, well, okay, I know a little bit about some of that stuff. And I said, so he said, look, would you talk to this guy? Would you meet this guy and talk with him? So Hoven brings me out to his place later on that week, Friday afternoon. I go out there, and this dude comes in, kind of a little mousy-looking dude. He's maybe like 150 pounds, and like his leather skin, like they'd been, he lived in the sun all the time. And it turns out that he starts asking me a bunch of questions. And I was pretty candid. I was just telling him answers to whatever his questions were. He was trying to figure out what I knew about stuff. He found out that I'd had 2 years of training in the Green Berets, and so he thought that was kind of cool. And I was legal counsel for the Jesuit National Headquarters. He thought that was kind of cool. And so we had these long set of conversations. Finally, he starts talking to me about the fact that he, in fact, was the former chief of security at the U.S. military mission in Tehran, Iran. He was a fluent Farsi speaker. He was in charge of anti-terrorism in Tehran for the U.S. military mission, and that he'd been a former CID, U.S. Marine Corps CID. He was the chief of security at Case in Vietnam. And he'd been an OSI, Office of Special Investigations, U.S. Air Force investigator. He'd been a cop in Oklahoma. Kind of lots of really interesting things this guy had done. And he, at the present time, was running a private airplane leasing outfit. And they were special little airplanes. They were this kind of European airplane that had the back end that it would drop open, and so you could parachute stuff out of it while you were still flying. It was like a C-123, if you're familiar with it, a big C-123, the big cargo planes that got the big drop back and stuff. They can drop stuff out of it. Well, these were little like mini C-123s, and he had a whole fleet of them, and he was renting them out. And he started telling me about the fact that he had been contacted by a man who will have to remain nameless, he said. And he said, but he wanted to know whether I would be willing to lease my entire fleet of planes to a private company up in Connecticut, and they were going to be bringing humanitarian supplies to people that were refugees from Nicaragua who were fleeing the totalitarian communist regime that had now established a totalitarian dictatorship in Nicaragua. And so he said, hey, I said, why not? You know, he said, I don't like commies, I'll do that, you know, and so he leases his whole fleet to him. And one of the planes I mentioned had been flying back from bringing these humanitarian supplies, and it went down and it was filled with cocaine, and he was upset. They offered to pay him for the whole thing, but he was still upset. But he didn't like that. And he'd been complaining about this, apparently publicly, you know, at the Heritage Foundation, you know, probably over drinks and whining in his beer to Paul Hoven. And so he starts telling me the whole story. And so I said, well, that's really interesting. And so I started explaining to him what I was doing, you know, and what I was looking into. And so he started getting all very interested in that. He said, look, let me take you to meet the guy who leased all of these airplanes from me. And you talk with him and see if you and he can get along. And so he ends up, a week later, we drive out to Virginia to this safe house, as it turns out. It was a CIA safe house. And the guy that he introduces me to is Carl Jenkins. And Carl Jenkins, as it turns out, is an extraordinarily interesting guy, a former United States Marine Corps. He was one of the very first guys to be transferred from the U.S. Marine Corps into the U.S. Army Special Forces to train Rangers when that program first began. And as it turns out, he was the guy that had leased all of these planes to fly the military equipment down to the Contras. And so I spent some time talking with him, then he mysteriously has his wife come over to the place, Elizabeth Jenkins, who turns out to be a full colonel in the Central Intelligence Agency. And she is the director of psychological evaluation in the Central Intelligence Agency. So she sits down and starts talking to me and asking me why I was doing this. And so I explained to her why I was doing this, you know. And so we get all done with explaining that thing, and he says, "Look, I got to tell you," he says, "I don't like this guy Shackley anyhow, who's running this whole thing." Well, that's the first time I'd heard about this guy. Who's this Shackley guy? He says, "Well, Shackley is the guy that ran covert operations for George H.W. when he was the DCI, Director of Central Intelligence." He said, "He's the guy running this whole thing. This is a Shackley operation." I never did like him. I didn't like him from back in Southeast Asia. When it turns out I was the liaison for Shackley as the CIA station chief, I was the liaison to Vang Pao, who was the opium warlord over in Laos. And I was the guy that was the go-between between the two of them. When Shackley set up the whole thing, where Shackley ran this project, really interesting project. He said that it turns out that Vang Pao was one of the 3 opium warlords in Laos back in the Far East, Southeast Asia. And he said, and what Shackley did when he became the Laotian station chief for the CIA, he set up a whole project where he set up a program where he got U.S. military planes to drop incendiary devices on the competitors of Vang Pao. And so they would put hound dog bumper beepers inside the saddlebags for the donkeys and stuff that they were hauling their opium out with. And then they'd come in these little P-23s or whatever they were. They would come in and they would locate the bumper beepers, and then they would drop incendiaries on them and kill them all. And so by doing this, they figured out a way to have Vang Pao become the monopoly controller of opium in Laos. And in gratitude for their services, Vang Pao agreed to give them a percentage of the new opium profits that he was making. And so what they did was really interesting. They reduced by a full 1/3 the total amount of opium coming out of Laos, but it turns out that all of it now was being handled by Vang Pao. And so Vang Pao became like 3 times more wealthy than he ever was, and they ended up reducing the overall amount coming out of Laos by 1/3, and Shackley got an award from the Central Intelligence Agency for doing it, okay? And so that's this guy Shackley he's talking about. And so he didn't like him. And he said, and Shackley set up a bank out in Australia, the Nugan Hand Bank, set up a private bank with Michael Nugan Michael Hand, over in Australia, and they were putting their portion of the profits over into that bank. And that Shackley was going through this whole process. And then he said, Shackley got into a bunch of trouble. Over there when he had set up the Phoenix program, and they had to take him out of there. But he started telling about how he didn't like this guy. And so all of a sudden, here I am, trying to gather information about what it is that's going on in Latin America. And it turns out I walk right into the middle of this thing with Carl Jenkins telling me all about who it is. And it turns out that Carl Jenkins, among his many other incarnations, was the former CIA case officer for Rafael Chichi Quintero. And Rafael Chichi Quintero turned out to be the number 2 man at Ilopango, he said. And Ilopango was a joint U.S. Salvadorian military base in El Salvador, where they were actually flying the military equipment out of Florida at the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport, flying it down to Ilopango, and then loading it onto other planes, and then those planes were flying over into Costa Rica onto John Hull's ranch, where they were unloading the weapons. And it turns out the cocaine was coming back the same way, coming back from John Hull's ranch down back to Ilopango, and then they would offload the cocaine at a U.S. military base and put it onto planes and then fly them up into the United States, okay? And Carl Jenkins was upset about this. And so he wanted to basically get this thing stopped, because he thought that this was going to get discovered and it was going to embarrass everybody. And so I basically didn't say to him, I said, what am I, chopped liver? If you're telling me, what do you think I'm going to do with this, But he didn't seem to say anything about that, but he just was giving me all of this information. So I proceeded to do this, and so it ended up that because Rafael Chichi Quintero was the number 2 man at Ilopango, he sat right in the middle, in the catbird seat, knowing everything that was going on with regard to this whole weapons and cocaine supply operation. And he was telling Carl Jenkins about it all the time. And Carl Jenkins was telling me about it all the time. And so I was just sitting there taking notes and filling the whole thing out and laying out the entire schematic of what was going on. And so we started getting all of this information put all together, and then he told me, Carl Jenkins told me, that there's a guy that you want to talk to that knows a lot about Shackley and how Shackley put this whole operation together, and his name is Edwin P. Wilson. Edwin P. Wilson was a Central Intelligence Agency covert operations specialist who basically figured out a way to set himself up with a cover of being a private businessman, and ended up being allowed by the Central Intelligence Agency to make millions and millions of dollars doing business by being sort of a proprietary cutout for the agency. And he was able to make money and live in a great big mansion out in Virginia, and he had houses in different parts of the world. And so he said that, but Wilson, something had happened, that Wilson had ended up getting put in jail. And Jenkins thought that Wilson was very bitter about this and that he might be willing to talk. And so I ended up going out to Indiana, Illinois, where he was. He was out in Marion Prison in Illinois. He was actually 4 floors beneath the ground in what they call K Block. This was the #1 maximum security prison in the entire United States before they built this big thing they built out in Colorado. But he was in the maximum security prison in K Block. And so he was 4 stories underground. And he was on deadlock for 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. And then he'd be allowed out to walk around in a little space about this size right here for 1 hour a day, where he could look up 6 floors, and see some sunlight. And then they'd put him back in his cell. And he was very unhappy about this. And so I go out to see him, and it took me maybe 2-3 visits with him to get him to understand that it was an intelligent thing for him to talk to me and explain what was going on. And he finally started talking to me and explaining what had happened. And what had happened is this, is that this fellow, Theodore Shackley, had a long track record. And I'll back up a little bit to let you know what we're dealing with here. That Theodore Shackley was a German-American that had come to the United States when he was still a boy with his family before World War II. He had been, he volunteered for the U.S. Army in 1941 after Pearl Harbor and was a German-American and Polish-American translator assigned to the 101st Counterintelligence Corps of the U.S. Army. At the end of the war, in the waning months of the war, of World War II, it turns out that the head of anti-Soviet intelligence for the Third Reich, Reinhard Gehlen, General Reinhard Gehlen, had realized that the Germans were going to lose the war. What he did is he microfilmed like 7 barrels of microfilm of all of the records of all the contacts that the Third Reich had all through Europe and all through the Soviet Union that were the spy network for the Third Reich, the fascist spy network. And he microfilmed all of those documents, put them in these 7 barrels, watertight barrels, and he and several other men from his group, they took them out of Berlin, and they went up into the mountains, up by a place called Oberammergau, up in the Bavarian mountains, and they buried these barrels in a meadow and hung out there in this big wooden lodge waiting for the end of the war to happen. And when the end of the war happened, Reinhard Gehlen, disguised in a U.S. Army private's uniform, leaves the sanctuary up there by Oberammergau and travels down and turns himself in to the U.S. military and says, oh, by the way, I'm Reinhard Gehlen. I'm the head of the Waffen-SS's, anti-Soviet intelligence. And you guys have got a big problem now that the war is over. You've got to have to confront the Soviet Union. You're going to need me. And I'll tell you what I'll do. I will make a deal with you. Now, of course, he'd said all of this in German, and the problem was that nobody understood what he was saying. And so they said, we better go get translators here. And so they go get a translator from the 101st Counterintelligence Corps. They bring him in, and it's Theodore Shackley. And so Shackley acts as the translator for Reinhard Gehlen in these negotiations. And then they realize what a prize they have here. And so that they take him to Fort Hunt outside of Washington, D.C., along with Theodore Shackley, his translator. And Shackley ends up as his negotiator with him for the matter of 3 or 4 weeks. He's at Fort Hunt, and he negotiates a major deal with the United States, pursuant to which Reinhard Gehlen is going to be allowed to not only have his name taken off the Nuremberg War Tribunal lists, so he won't have to be tried as a war criminal, but also he names about 100 other men that he wants to have taken off the Nuremberg War Tribunal list who are going to be working with him, and he wants to be made the new head of intelligence for West Germany. When Germany is divided between the Soviet space and the Western space, he wants to be the new head of intelligence. And so he makes the deal and they agree to this thing. And he will put at the disposal of the new allied nations, the NATO nations, his Galen's org. Okay? So he does this, and he gets made the head of West German intelligence and serves for 26 years as the chief source of anti-Soviet intelligence for the NATO nations. Okay? And he does an additional thing. He establishes an academy at Oberammergau that's called the Anti-Communist Special Warfare Training Academy. And he puts in charge of that a man by the name of General Otto Skorzeny. Otto Skorzeny had been the commandant of the special forces of the SS. Big 6'5", saber scar, 6-league boots, guy about 270 pounds, great big behemoth, and an extraordinary person, brilliant, bold, courageous, and completely ruthless. And he is the guy who broke out El Duce, that Mussolini, when Mussolini was captured by American forces and brought up into a big castle up in the mountains of Italy and being held prisoner there toward the end of the war, this guy Otto Skorzeny is a guy that designed himself a hang glider and got on top of a mountain and hang glided down off the top of the mountain into this castle and went in and broke out El Duce personally and brought him up onto the parapets of the castle, put him under one arm, and got the hang glider and hang glided down out of the castle, down into the meadows, and broke El Duce out of prison, all by himself. That's who this guy is. It broke Mussolini out. So the bottom line is that this guy is selected by Reinhard Gehlen, General Gehlen, the head of the anti-Soviet intelligence for the Third Reich, chooses this guy to run this academy. And they take 1,200 men from around the world that were in the Allied intelligence forces, and they go to this school over a period between 1948 and 1965. They have 1,200 men go to this school where they're trained in every ruthless tactic necessary to defeat the communists. Now, all one has to do is reflect upon this a bit and try to understand that the position taken by the Third Reich against the communists cannot honestly be characterized as just anti-communism. The Third Reich has an affirmative thesis. They're not just anti-communist. They are pro-fascist. And they believe in a very specific theory of governance, which is an authoritarian, national, capitalist system where they have subsidized capitalism. Not free market capitalism, not democratic capitalism, but a system of capitalism that is financed by the state so that they subsidize major corporations that are viewed by the state to be essential to the functioning of the state, but the private capitalists are allowed to maintain possession of the companies and to take the profits. That's part of the major theory behind the Third Reich. And so that this is taught at the academy. And it's taught to these guys who are being trained not just to be anti-communist warriors and Cold War covert operation warriors, but they're taught the affirmative values. And that these 1,200 men who are trained at that base from every single one of the Allied nations, including Israel, are trained to spread out across the world inside the intelligence communities of the new Allied nations at the end of the World War II to rise to the top of power and to be a horizontal brotherhood, an alliance with each other, and that their loyalty to each other and to the values that they were taught by Otto Skorzeny and Reinhard Gehlen are more powerful than their loyalty to their own governments, and more powerful than their vertical loyalty to their countries. Okay? And that is what Theodore Shackley was sent to be in that first class. He was in the entering class of the Central Intelligence Agency that was created by the National Security Act of 1947. And after graduating from the CIA training academies, was sent to the training school, the Special Anti-Communist Warfare Training Academy, where he became compadres with the likes of Michael Harari and others. This is who we're dealing with, he said, with Theodore Shackley. And Shackley had gone on to, and he was then, after he graduated from that academy, he was made the number 2 to Reinhard Gehlen in Berlin, an American CIA officer assigned to be number 2 to Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of West German intelligence and the de facto head of anti-Soviet intelligence for the Allied nations. And Shackley was there from 1949 or so all the way through till 1962, when he was taken and brought in to be the CIA station chief in Miami to help run the anti-Castro covert operations under not Operation 40, but when it was renamed Operation Mongoose. And in that capacity, he was the one responsible for overseeing the conduct of the S-Force, which was the assassination group that had been put together by Richard Nixon and Howard Hughes to assassinate Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the others. So this is the guy that we're dealing with here. He is the major domo. He, in fact, was the Dr. Moriarty to our collective Sherlock Holmes, trying to figure out what was going on in the world. And Ed Wilson explained all of this to us, as did Carl Jenkins. And Ed Wilson explained how what Shackley had done is when Shackley was after he had been the CIA station chief in Miami, when that Operation Mongoose was shut down in 1965, he was transferred to Laos, originally to Cambodia, and then to Laos, where he was the deputy CIA station chief in Laos, and then became the CIA station chief in Laos, where he established this relationship with Vang Pao and set up this covert operation of being covertly funded for black operations through the opium money. And then when he became the CIA station chief in Saigon, and then he created a thing called the Phoenix Program that assassinated over 100,000 non-combatant civilians. Now, even Richard Helms acknowledged that 20,000 people had been assassinated by that program, but it's actually more like 100,000 people were assassinated by that program. And he set that whole thing up, and it was covertly funded with the opium money. And then what happened, we found out about that. All that Carl Jenkins would say to me is that something had happened, and Shackley had been taken out of Vietnam as the CIA station chief and brought back to the United States because there was some kind of trouble that he got into. And I didn't know what that was until I got a call at my office from Gerald Zeitman. Gerald Zeitman called me at my office, and he said, look, my name is Gerald Zeitman. I am the chief counsel for the House Judiciary Committee, and I think you and I should talk. So I get a hold of Sarah, and Sarah and I go to meet him, and he wants to meet outside of the office. He wants to meet at a little restaurant in Washington. So we go to sit down with him, and he starts to tell us the story. He said, look, when I became chief counsel for the House Judiciary Committee in the House of Representatives, I felt like I'd been recruited to play the organ in my church. I was so proud. And he said, but I later discovered that I wasn't being asked to play the organ in church. I was being asked to play honky-tonk piano in a whorehouse. He said, but at least I thought I knew what was happening upstairs. But people weren't getting screwed. They were getting murdered, he says. And he wanted to tell me a story. He said what happened when he was the chief counsel for the House Judiciary Committee, Richard Nixon had contacted Peter Rodino, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and said, look, a problem has arisen here. Creighton Abrams has been made the commanding general for all Southeast Asian military forces, and he's got some kind of religious experience he's had, he said, where he's getting all kind of moralistic. This is how it was reported from Nixon. And that he's gotten all upset because he's found out about a thing that Theodore Shackley has done. Theodore Shackley was planning to assassinate Laotian neutralist Prince Suvarnabhuma. There was a thing going on in Laos. There were three different competing, just like there were three different competing opium warlords, there were three different competing political forces. And there was a neutralist force under Suvarnabhuma. And there was a right-wing fascist force that Shackley wanted to rise to the ascendancy. So he was planning to assassinate Suvarnabhuma. And they got frightened because it turns out that one of the guys that was around their office of the assassination, the Phoenix program that they had, it was discovered that his mistress turned out to be the mistress as well for a North Vietnamese general. And Shackley freaked out, saying, wait a second, that makes us vulnerable. This guy may have found out about our plan to assassinate Suvarnabhuma. He may have told his girlfriend. She may have told, he is a total security threat. We've got to eliminate him. And he put out the order to have him assassinated. And he said, but in order to have no one talk about this, because it is one of our own South Vietnamese CIA guys, I want the person who's his best friend to pull the trigger. And so they got three guys, one of whom was the best friend of this guy, and they take him, they cuff him, they bring him out into the jungle, they put him in a boat, and they bring him out into this lake, and his friend puts 3 slugs in his head and kills him. And they tie rocks to him and drop him in the lake. And as the days went by, this guy started feeling horrible about what he had done, and he ended up going directly to Creighton Abrams and telling Creighton Abrams what had happened. And Creighton Abrams starts a major investigation, and they're investigating him and Colonel Rowe and 4 other guys who were actually on the team that was supposed to kill Suvarnabhuma. And so what happens is Creighton Abrams starts this major investigation, and so the Central Intelligence Agency pulls Shackley out of Saigon and brings him back to the United States. But this investigation is going on against Colonel Rowe and these other guys. And so what happens is Nixon calls Peter Rodino, the head of the Judiciary Committee, and says to him, look, I want you to get a hold of the 5 congressmen that are from the home districts of these guys that are being investigated by Creighton Abrams, who's gone off the deep end with this religious experience that he's having. And I want you to apply pressure, political pressure, to get all the charges dismissed against them. And Peter Rodino brings this assignment to Gerald Zeifman. And Gerald Zeifman goes ahead and organizes this whole thing and gets all the charges dropped against them. And then these guys are so happy, they take him out to a celebration, and they all get drunk together, and they all start telling him about what they've been doing over there. Because they think he's kind of one of them. And so they end up spilling the whole beans to this guy, and he doesn't know who to go tell. So Zeifman comes and tells us. So it turns out that I now found out about what it was that had happened to Shackley, right? And so I'm out at Carl Jenkins the next time, and Carl Jenkins happens to make a pass again at what a bad guy this Shackley is, and how this thing had happened, that he'd been taken out of there. He said, but you don't need to know about that. And I said, that's okay, I do know about that. And he said, you don't know about that at all. And I said, yes, I do. And I told him. I didn't tell him how I knew, but I told him exactly what had happened. And it caused Carl Jenkins to be so impressed, as it turns out, that he offered me a job. Actually, he wanted me to be general counsel to a helicopter company that he was starting down in Belize that was smuggling weapons to the Contras, right? And I said, well, thank you, no, I'm not really interested in that. But he then took me into his conference, and he started telling me all kinds of things about what they were all doing. And so I had this kind of flow going directly from Rafael Chichi Quintero's CIA case officer, former CIA case officer, who was the number 2 guy at Ilopango under Felix Rodriguez. And so I started having all this information. We put all of this information together. We found all about the routes through which they were smuggling the cocaine. We had the tail numbers on the airplanes. We had the code words they used for landing. We had the coordinates for the landing strips. We had copies of the written invoices for the military equipment. We had copies of the false end-user certificates that were being put out by Ronald Joseph Martin in the Tamiami gun shop. We had them totally nailed, right? We even knew about the Refrigerifico de Punta Arenas, which was this refrigerator boat that they used to bring the cocaine, some of it, by boat up from Latin America, up into Florida, and they brought it to Ocean Hunter, this company that was owned by Paco Chanez, and we knew what the code words were that you used to call. We knew the private unlisted telephone number of the place where they would distribute it from, and what the code words were to be able to get into the house. And so I go with Gene Wheaton to an old friend of his who's the head of the DEA. Now this is the head of the DEA Special Strike Force, right? And he's a guy that Gene knew from way back when they were together in the Marine Corps. And so I go to the DEA Special Strike Force headquarters. I sit down with the head guy. I hand him the memo with everything in it, with all the code words, all the phone numbers, the names of all the people that are at the house and everything. And I push it over to him, and he looks at it, and he reads it, and he pushes it back to me. And he says, "Look, Dan, you know what this is, and so do I. I plan to live to see my retirement," he says. Right? And so I go down to the U.S. Attorney in Miami, and I go into his office, and I sit down with him, and I tell him about what I've got, about the guns going on, the drug smuggling going on, et cetera. He said, "Well," he said, "I hear what you're saying," he said, "but I'll tell you what," he said, you'd have to have your people come and testify under oath, and the only people that I would take the statements from are people that were directly criminally involved. So they had direct knowledge. And of course, I'd have to prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. And so that's what I'll have to do. And I said, "Wait a second. You're talking about, you're going to prosecute our sources, but none of the people that are doing it?" And he said, "Well, that's my position," right? So I get up out of his office, and I'm walking out, and he's going the other way, and I go over to his secretary, and I said, "Gee," I said, "I just had an interesting conversation with the U.S. Attorney." I said, "Did he tell you about the phone call that he got this morning?" And she looked around like this. She said, "No, but I didn't know anybody else knew about that." And I said, "Well, yes, I did. He told me about that." And she said, "Yeah, well, Mr. Meese called him. Mr. Meese called him and just said, look at this thing, that there's a Sheehan guy coming to talk with you, and whatever he tells you about, I want that investigation to go very, very, very slowly." So she tells me like that, right? And so I
Attorney General then?
no, he was the U.S. Attorney. He was the U.S. Attorney in Miami. Yeah.
Edward Meese from D.C.
Edward Meese at that time was the Attorney General.
Yes.
As of that point. That's right. And so we had all of that information. We had all the details about what they were doing. It was perfectly clear. Leon Kellner, his name was. Leon Kellner, who was the U.S. Attorney in Miami, wasn't going to do a single thing about this except prosecute our sources. The DEA strike force people weren't going to do a single thing about this. Nobody wanted to do anything about this, and obviously the administration were the ones doing it. And so we decided that what we had to do is we had to file a major federal lawsuit. And so what I did is I drafted up the lawsuit, the complaint, and before I filed it, I went over and I sat down with Scott Armstrong, who was the director of the National Security Archives. And Scott Armstrong is the guy I'd mentioned to you earlier. He was the guy on Peter Rodino's House Judiciary Committee staff during the impeachment investigation of Richard Nixon. Scott Armstrong is the guy who was interviewing Alexander Butterfield when Butterfield told Scott Armstrong about the tape recording system. in the Oval Office for Richard Nixon that enabled the Judiciary Committee to get at the tapes of Richard Nixon talking about in the smoking gun conversation that ended up getting him to have to resign from office, right? And so Scott Armstrong was pretty well situated with Peter Rodino. So I go sit down with Scott Armstrong and I lay out to him. I show him a copy of the draft complaint that I've got, and he looked at it and read through the whole thing, and he says, this is preposterous. This is preposterous what you're saying here. He says, look, this guy Shackley, he's Southeast Asian guy. He doesn't have anything to do with Latin America at all. This guy Secord was in the Defense Department over in Iran or something. He doesn't have anything to do with Latin America at all. And I said, well, he does, and they do. And here's all the details of it. And I said, look, I want you to check this out for a couple days before I file this thing. And he says, okay, look, I'll do that. I'll do this. So he calls me back a couple days later and wants me to come over to see him at the National Security Archive. So I go over there, and he said, well, I'll be a son of a bitch, he says. It's true. He says, I gave all this stuff to Cy Hirsch. And Cy checked it all out, and it all checks out. Nobody knew about this. He said, this is something. He said, here's what I'm going to do. He said, I'm going to go over and see Peter Rodino. He's still the head of the Judiciary Committee. I'm going to tell him all about this. He's going to set up a select committee to look into this. He'll make me chief of staff. I'll be the chief of staff, says Scott. And so we'll get these guys, and we'll impeach these people. He said, give me a couple days, and I'll get back to you. So a couple days go by. I leave, a couple days go by. I don't hear anything from him. Another couple days go by. I don't hear anything from him. So I call up Tom Blanton, who's his deputy over there. I call Tom. I say, Tommy, what the hell's going on? I said, Scott was going to call me back about the meeting I had. He said, oh, gee, he said, you got to come over here. So I come over, and I go in to see Tom Blanton, and Blanton says, look, we can't talk in the office here. Let's go outside. So we go outside into the hallway, and we sit down. And he said, look, Scott went over and talked to Peter Rodino about all this, and he laid all this stuff out to Peter Rodino. And when he got all done talking to him, Peter Rodino said, my God, he said, this is horrible. He said, I think I may have mentioned this to you once before. He said, this is horrible. He said, why, I've been telling everybody if they didn't like the way the United States government policy was going, they ought to write a letter to their congressman. He said, and I told him, I said, if the congressman doesn't do anything about it, then vote for somebody else and get a different congressman. He said, but if what you're telling me is true, why then, my God, he said, we haven't even been in charge. I'm not going to allow the Congress of the United States to investigate anything like that, is what he said. And so we couldn't get the Judiciary Committee that was constitutionally required to investigate potential impeachable offenses. We couldn't get the Justice Department to do anything except prosecute the people that were our sources, to silence them. And we couldn't get the DEA strike force to do anything because the guy prized his life more than his integrity. And so we decided we were going to file the complaint. So we prepared the complaint, and we prepared to file it on the 2 days before the 2-year anniversary of the bombing at Panka, using Tony Abergon as the major plaintiff with standing in setting forth a federal criminal racketeering enterprise as the overall umbrella of what the operation is that they were engaged in. It's a statute that allows you to prosecute an ongoing criminal conspiracy that uses as a series of overt acts which are specific types of criminal violations: murder, assassination, suborning perjury, intimidating witnesses, drug smuggling, etc. And so we drafted up the complaint, and we were prepared to file it on the 29th of May of 1986, which was basically 2 years after we started doing the entire investigation, because I'd been tied up having to do the case down in Greensboro and the Carthan case during the interim of these things. So that 2 years to the day, basically, we filed the complaint. And I will tell you, starting on Tuesday, we'll be talking about the actual preparation for trial, discovery process, et cetera. Okay? So there's the beginning of the Iran-Contra case. Okay?